How many of you have heard of Tide Center? It's an advocacy group heavily funded by far-left billionaire kingmaker George Soros that sponsored some nonprofits who've justified, believe it or not, Hamas's bloody attacks and earned more than $1.2 million through contracts at the Department of Education and other city agencies. And let's go up to New York. Big Apple taxpayers have shelled out nearly $9 million since 2010, including $3.3 million over the past 2 years to 4 nonprofits that help spearhead anti-Israel protests where demonstrators openly cheered Hamas terrorist attacks on the Jewish state. And let me just tell you this. A post-examination of city records shows more than $4.25 million, or nearly half of the cash, was funneled through yearly pots of political pork that city council members dish out to help raise local support and sway votes during re-election bids. Scott Waller is Capital Research Center's CEO. Talk about the Tide Center and what these far-left organizations are doing in funding Hamas and these other terrorist organizations around the world.
Well, Armstrong, all of us are horrified to see the kinds of ugliness and Jew hatred and the rest on college campuses and even in high schools and, of course, in big cities, all the way to the White House. And it is appalling, but it is not surprising to me because I study the left. The left has hated Israel, and they've not been too fond of Jews in general for decades. And Soros, in fact, as you mentioned, he is one of the biggest funders of anti-Semitism on the planet, outside of a few.
But he's also Jewish.
Oil kingdoms. Well, he was born Jewish. He identifies as atheist now. And of course, sadly, as I said, the left has been funding this kind of thing for a very long time, and you're now seeing the fruits of that. And it is, I grant you, it's ironic because Soros is by no means the only left-wing funder who has a Jewish background. It's very puzzling. I think some of them now are starting to sober up when they see just how ugly these fruits that they've produced are. But you mentioned the Tide Center. Well, there's Tides is actually an empire of at least a half a dozen different organizations, Tides Foundation, Tides Center, and others. And the way that they work is, one critical thing that they provide is camouflage for the funding or hiding the funding. So you write a check to the Tides Foundation or the Tides Center, and that may be, if you do it from your foundation, that is going to be on the public record. But then once it goes into the Tides nexus, nobody knows where the money comes out. So we don't know when one foundation gives $1 million to Tides, where it ends up elsewhere. Now, what we do know is that Tides, on the other hand, does make lots of grants to multiple different groups that are viciously anti-Israel and pro-Hamas.
Can you elaborate on the role of private donors in shaping the discourse around the Israeli-Hamas conflict on college campuses?
Yes, again, the entire left-wing network of this, what is typically called dark money, at least it is if conservatives are doing anything like this, that has been funding all sorts of lefty efforts that are anti-Israel. Give you a great example, a group called Palestine Legal, right? It gets its money through the Tides network. We don't know from who the original donors were. We also know that a lot of that money comes in using the Act Blue platform that is the standard left-wing platform for left-wing politicians and left-wing nonprofit groups. And again, nobody knows, if I gave money tonight to Act Blue saying I want it to go to Samadoun, say, this particularly nasty anti-Israel group, you're never going to be able to tell that I gave that money because all you know is that I gave money to Act Blue, and then you know that Act Blue gave money to the Tide Center. Nobody has any idea what's actually happening. If they didn't have these kinds of networks to hide the funding, they wouldn't be as successful at raising the funding.
How do you see these donor influences impacting the broader understanding of conflict among students?
Well, that's a very good question, and it actually gets to the heart of the whole problem because, why do you have high school kids who couldn't find the Mediterranean Sea, much less Palestine or Israel on a map, instantly be, I'm against Israel and I'm for Hamas? And that is because the left has taught them that anybody who has any suffering in his life or isn't doing as well as his neighbor is oppressed, and therefore he's all good. And then there's some incredibly evil oppressor who is causing him to fail to flourish and have his wonderful life. This Israeli-Hamas conflict, sadly, gets put into that crude, false matrix so that Palestinians suffer and Israel does well. Therefore, Israel is a cruel, brutal oppressor. That's why you have high school kids and college kids who know virtually nothing about history, geography, or anything else immediately jumping on the side of hideous terrorists. I mean, it shows you what the left does to people's brains.
It's easy to pinpoint someone like George Soros and ties, but what we don't often talk about is that there are a lot of Arab money that infiltrates these institutions and other organizations in this country.
Well, you're right about that too, Armstrong. I'm a Georgetown University graduate, and Georgetown has long had, for instance, generous support in various programs from the Arab oil world. And you see the same thing, the Chinese communists, of course, are also famous. I mean, the degree to which foreign funders infiltrate colleges, and then another part of this intellectual world, the DC think tanks. Even the Washington Post has done some good reporting because they were so scandalized to see Qatar or UAE, for example, giving money to places like the Atlantic Council, which is a very serious thing. It has all kinds of people tied to Capitol Hill with it. For instance, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a bête noire of mine, his wife receives money from the Atlantic Council. Well, be interesting to know how much of that money came from UAE and other oil kingdoms, especially given the senator's hatred of anybody who's supported by oil money.
Here's another fascinating number: $40 billion. What could this number possibly represent? Well, I'll tell you what it represents, America. It represents the total amount of aid given to Palestine between 1994 in 2020, $40 billion. Are you kidding me? Just take a look at what Palestine looks like. All that aid money, where do you think it went? Do you think that $40 billion was spent building up the infrastructure and feeding its poor people and building hospitals? Do you think it just vanished into thin air? No. We know exactly where that money went. It went to the leaders of Hamas and to the pockets of the higher-ups in Hamas. International aid to the tune of $40 billion has gone into building weapons and funding the lavish lifestyle of terrorists. So the question that remains, Scott, is why do we continue to give money to countries like Palestine when we know exactly what's going to happen to it? It's not like this is all a secret. We know how wealthy Hamas leaders are. And we've known how much money we give to Palestine, how much the entire world gives it. Just think about this. 3 of the top 8 leaders in Hamas is worth a total of $11 billion who live a lavish lifestyle. Whom do you think is funding this?
Well, I couldn't agree more, Armstrong. And I am so old I can remember when Yasser Arafat was the head of the Palestinians, and he did exactly the same thing. His wife gorged on the finest things you could buy in Paris. When he died, it was revealed he was a billionaire. If you care about suffering in Palestine, then you sure ought to care about that kind of ridiculous funding. And by the way, don't forget, it isn't just our government giving money to Palestine. In the last few years, our government has given billions upon billions to Iran and released them out of all kinds of sanction difficulties. And that money went to terrorists in Palestine, too. It's really shameful. And the average American taxpayer ought to be outraged.
Does Israel have clean hands?
Well, I wouldn't presume to tell the folks who actually have to live in the extremely dangerous part of the world that how they should live. But what I will say is, in Israel, they are a functioning democracy. So there are lots of Israelis who don't agree with the current leadership of Israel, and the current leadership may change. Unfortunately, you don't see that kind of democratic give and take and debate and criticism and changing of leadership among the Palestinians, which is a big part of their problem.
Why isn't it talked about enough that there are a lot of liberal Jews out of New York that really support this pro-Palestinian movement, these protests? They're out there marching along with them.
Well, I think there's some signs that people who previously had been much more critical of Israel among American Jews and Jewish donors, I think you're starting to see at least the beginnings of change in that. There are some major Jewish donors to universities, for instance, who have begun working to put pressure on those universities not to be coddling people who celebrate barbaric terrorism.
You know, look, if a country wants to fund terrorism, they should just outright state it. It's not like they're out of touch, okay? And no one is not going to eventually figure out what they're doing. They can obviously see that there's zero progress in Palestine, yet the money still keeps flowing in. And what do they have to show for it? If you want to stop Hamas reign in Palestine, it's simple. Stop giving them money. Cut off all the aid, and that'll cut off their ability to build and purchase weapons. Cut off the aid, and it will prevent more deaths and more terrorist activities. We all know how resourceful Hamas is, how they've used water pipes provided by Israel to aid Palestinians into rockets. What do you think they're going to do with $40 billion? We just have to stop this. You know, how can people find out more about Capital Research Center?
Well, you can go to capitalresearch.org is our main site, but what I would especially urge is go to influencewatch.org and just put in some of these groups that you see connected to the protests.
Heather Johnston is CEO and founder of U.S.-Israel Education Association. She will join us when we return on Your Voice, Your Future. Thank you for joining us, Scott, and for your research. And welcome back. Heather Johnston is the founder and CEO of the U.S.-Israel Education Association. What is your association?
Well, we have a wonderful education association where we're really strengthening the U.S.-Israel collaboration, working with Congress, educating, taking senior leaders of Congress on advanced trips to Israel through the West Bank. And so we've been at this for about a decade and a half, and it has been an extraordinary process. We feel like we've contributed greatly to the U.S.-Israel collaboration.
You know, why does it appear that so many young people on some of the most celebrated Ivy League institutions in the country are so misguided, so indoctrinated, where they show just complete blind solidarity to Hamas? Where is this education coming from?
It's remarkable, Armstrong. It is so hard to believe that we're watching our college campuses erupt into this extraordinary lack of understanding. It's not just anti-Semitism. It is absolute ignorance to the real reality that's on the ground. It's a departure from reality. It's the height of surrealism.
But how do you take a kid from high school to college and they become so fervent? I mean, death to Jews, chanting slogans that they really don't understand what the meaning is, attacking kids. I mean, even if you disagree with them, but attacking them,
right,
brutalizing them, where's it coming from?
Well, it's an indoctrination of hate.
From where?
And I think that there are plenty of people out there in the Arab world that hate.
Are they in our institutions?
They're in our institutions.
Are the professors indoctrinating them?
Yes, they are.
Let's talk about that.
I think there are. And I think there are organizations on the campuses that are indoctrinating and presenting really a false narrative that the Jews have oppressed the Palestinians, oppressed the Arab world. and that they are these colonialists that have taken over huge swaths of the Middle East, and they have this little teeny area that's the size of New Jersey. And it comes to the West Bank, and Israel only lives on 7% of the West Bank. Did you hear what I just said? 93% of the West Bank is where the Palestinians live. 7% the Jews have. So in this area called Area C, it's remarkable. It's a false narrative. And the hate is coming from, I believe, organizations that really foment that oppression and that the Jews should be hated. And
you know what? I'll give you that. But there's something deeper going on here.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing for the New York Times, which is owned by Jews, if I can be so candid. When the hospital blast happened right after the war began, the headline was Israel demolished this hospital. And then the narratives, what they're allowed, what is printed, and their narratives, it's not just these students. You can say it's one thing for these students to be indoctrinated by professors, but it seems as if the mainstream media are enablers of this, and they only print one side for so long that these kids begin to believe, well, what my professors teach us, we have to believe it, because this is what the mainstream media. Why?
I believe it's
and
been
these are intelligent people.
Yeah, it is. It's intelligent people who are misguided and have really not understood the narrative, though. Because if you go to Israel and you understand the narrative, you really do look at history, it's just not what's being presented. And what is being presented makes you angry at the Jews. And so there's this fomenting, and it's being carried on generation to generation. And it's unfortunate. I think that what we're seeing, though, is that when evil is exposed to the utmost degree, finally people start going, wait, that does not look right. Something is wrong with that. People start going, that is not right on our college campuses, and we're going to defund that. We're not going to pay for that anymore. The donors aren't going to support that anymore, and you can change your situation on these college campuses. And I think that's the redemptive part of what could be taking place here.
You know, it seems as though that if Hamas or the Palestinians say to the mainstream media or to students on these campuses, this is what happened, these are results, these are the casualties, this is how this came about, there's no need to check out whether any of this is true. It's as if they go with the story. Mindless, blind. But if Israel, it has to be tested, vetted. When they talked about the kids that were beheaded, how they were savagely killed, and all this, it's as if it had to be verified again and again before the mainstream media and people who are sophisticated and educated decided, well, maybe Israel is a victim, the Hamas this time. Maybe, why?
Well, I think that has been the responsibility. That's the leadership responsibility. And I'll be honest with you, I'm with the Israeli leaders all the time. I'm over there 3 or 4 times a year. I take Congress over there. They don't mind being the leaders inside the Middle East. We've got to have an adult inside the Middle East that's able to lead. And leaders take responsibility. They're able to show the facts. And so Israel has made it their ambition. When they see terrorist acts take place, they go get the film crews to come in, come and film this, come show what's taken place, and we will show the world. And so
But that standard doesn't exist for the other side.
No, it does not. And so they live with that imbalance. They live understanding that the world is against them. They know who they are, though.
Yeah, but then you have members of Congress, like the Squad, like Tlaib, who's unapologetic in the things that she says, and you have Ilhan Omar, and you have members of Congress. I mean, a member of Congress that was just censored, who's literally no different than the protesters.
Right, they're no different, but she's playing to her political base. I mean, there's no question about that. Her district is Palestinian, and she is carrying this burden that is misguided. And so she
Do you think she actually believes what she advocates?
You
think she's brainwashed also?
Are you kidding me? I think she believes
of Congress
it
are
to
just
the fiber of her being.
Indoctrinated just like the students on college campus.
Yes, that is exactly right. This is not a show. It is not a play of things. This is who she is. It's where she's come from, her history. It's where she was born. I mean, her family's there. So she's living out a narrative. and she's emotionally subscribing to it. She's narrating it for the public, and that is her story, and she is sticking to it.
But it is fascinating to me, the Biden administration's evolving approach to this Israel-Hamas conflict. They want to push humanitarian. They want to stop for a few hours and make sure they get humanitarian aid in there. But yet, Hamas, in the New York Times, I read it, they could care less about the Palestinians. They wanted to escalate a regional war. They're using the funds to build their weaponry, to deny the people in Gaza food. And when the people in Gaza were trying to leave, they would shoot them down like animals.
Right.
You don't care. But even with this in the New York Times, people still want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're justified in fighting a colonialist apartheid regime.
That's exactly right, and it just continues to be reverberated over and over again in the news. I think that Israel is proving, and as the Biden administration has stepped up more to the plate and is standing more with Israel, more vocally next to Israel, putting our military might in the Mediterranean Sea, and has taken an actual stand. Even the State Department today said, what would be nice is, rather than Israel not having to bomb the hospital, would be if Hamas would walk out of the hospital, if they would stop putting their command centers under the hospital, if they would retreat on their prerogatives inside this war, and if they would release the people out of the hospital, if they would have taken the fuel that was offered to them by Israel yesterday. That was a State Department spokesperson today. So as Biden's administration has stepped up more and has been much more vocal, standing with Israel, and yes, there's certain things that are being said that bring confusion. For the most part, in a comprehensive way, we've had an administration that's standing with Israel during this war. So I think that's affecting that liberal base. It's affecting how the media is playing this out. And so that's a little bit of where we are today.
Yeah, but you have protesters marching to the president's home saying that he's a supporter of genocide.
They're crazy.
You know, where do we make progress in terms of educating and changing the narrative? Where do you fall short?
Well, I think that what we have to be speaking out there, and Armstrong, you're doing this really well, I think that we have to be helping world leaders and then helping young people on campuses to define reality accurately. You know, when Winston Churchill and the rise of the Nazi regime, his counterpart, Prime Minister Chamberlain, did shuttle diplomacy. He tried to appease the Nazi regime. He was trying to make things work in his day in the midst of this evil, horrific situation in Europe. But it took a Winston Churchill who defined reality accurately. And he chose a side, and he went with that side, and he stood there to the end, and he defended liberty and freedom. And in doing so, he liberated the world of the Nazi regime. He goes down in history as that. Our young people, these people protesting in the streets, we've got to help bring reality to the United States of America. We've got to define it accurately so people can choose a side and stay on that side. And I think that's what's happening in the world today. I think nations are choosing sides. International leaders are choosing a side today. And we've got our Congress choosing a side, mostly with Israel. And I believe that the United States has chosen Israel. I believe that's happening.
You know, I've been to the Holy Land 17 times. My history tells me that the Muslims, many of them fought along the side of Adolf Hitler during World War I. The Arabs had the worst slave trade from Africa. That's often not even talked about in the history books. It's just glossed over as if it did not exist. And I never thought it could be possible that a Holocaust could happen again.
Yeah, I know it.
In the United States. But when you listen at the environment and what people are saying and you speak to them privately, you know, it's very possible.
Yes, you see how that train of thought, those emotions, that narrative can come into a whole other generation. and can be believed and then executed. So it's I'm watching Congress make some changes, and we're watching both the House and Senate come with anti-Semitism laws, where you're going to see the enforcing of a law against anti-Semitism on campuses. You're not going to see campuses continue to be funded, colleges, universities continue to be funded with government funding anyway. If you're going to facilitate or support or allow anti-Semitism on your campus, this is happening.
You would assume that people who have been disenfranchised, I remember how many Jews, they made the sacrifice along with Black Americans during the civil rights movement. And, it is sad to think that they believe that Hamas is a minority, that somehow or another they're disenfranchised, that they're exploited, they're oppressed, and they're taken advantage of. And, the fact is, even for people who stand up for gender and homosexuality, if they were to go to Palestine and Hamas, and if women, how they would be treated, do they really understand who they protest for, how they really feel about them? And what happened on October 7th? They just did not kill Jews, they killed Muslims.
That's right.
They didn't care. They killed indiscriminately people.
Right.
They didn't care children, they didn't care. Their goal was just to kill people. They could care less about these people who protest. They're just useful tools for them.
That's right. And I think you accurately defined that. And I think Hamas, if you look at their charter, they only have one focus, one mission statement, and that was the annihilation of the Jewish state. They exist as a terrorist organization. They're a non-state actor. They're not anything except for they are an organization that took the helm of the Gaza Strip. And it's unfortunate because that was their one and single aim. So whoever gets in the way, whether you're a civilian, you're a doctor trying to take care of a child in the hospital, we're going to kill you if you get in our way in our effort to kill Israel.
And just remember this. They would like to bring Gaza to New York City or Los Angeles. And they just don't hate Jews. They're envy because their governments cannot measure up to the success and what Israel has been able to accomplish. Israel measures up against them and show their failed leadership and their failed governments. But they just don't hate Jews. They hate Christians also. They may come for you tomorrow, but it's us next week. And we must stand in solidarity, and we make no apologies about that. I believe what is moral, not what is immoral. And their mission is immoral. And you can lay down your arms, you can all ceasefire, they will continue to kill you until they exterminate you from the face of the planet. Heather Johnston, thank you so much for joining us. When we come back, this conversation will continue on Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams. This is just breaking. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser has declared a public emergency in the District of Columbia and says her office will utilize new tools to combat two critical issues plaguing your nation's capital: the ongoing opioid crisis and the rise in youth violence. She says the public emergency declaration will allow your nation's capital to respond more efficiently and urgently to these two problems by authorizing expedited procurement, the disbursement of funds, and the activation, implementation, and coordination of mutual aid agreements between the district and federal, state, or local jurisdictions as appropriate. Leonard Snipes, Jr., crime media relations expert, and Sal Greco, 14-year NYPD veteran. When you hear the mayor of the District of Columbia make this declaration, especially after Joe Biden's granddaughter was impacted by this, Secret Service had to shoot at them because they were trying to hijack the car. What does this tell you, Greco?
Armstrong, this actually sounds a lot like what's going on in New York City, to be honest. It looks like a plague that's, plagued the entire nation. I had one interaction there in D.C. back on January 5th and 6th there where she had everybody that was inside. So we were in the hotel at the Willard, and then we had to leave because out of nowhere she granted some kind of executive order that stated that everyone had to leave any hotel or any lobby of a hotel due to some COVID restrictions she just implemented that morning. So, I mean, she seems like she's in the mold of like the mayor of Chicago and the mayor of and Los Angeles, and they all have these crazy left-wing policies that they clearly don't work. And what I'm hearing right now, I can't even grasp my brain.
Well, Greco, what is it that she and other mayors need to do in these major hubs?
I don't know if they have a council or who they speak to around them. I would first start with maybe they should speak to officers that are on the ground, because they seem to gloss over that, and they should have a meeting with them. Also, city council, where they talk to the public, the community, have their input on things, because you can't just implement rules and laws and executive orders and then the people are revolting against you saying, what is this? What are you doing? I mean, you have crack being sold out there, out in the open, and fentanyl, and you arrest somebody and then they come right out not even 5 minutes later, they're right back on the street doing the same thing again. Now you have this influx of undocumented that are going to every city and causing chaos because there's nowhere to put them. I mean, it's one epidemic after the other. And I don't think these mayors, no one's talking to each other, federal government or the mayors of all these different cities, because, Joe Biden is shipping illegal immigrants all over the place and could care less of any input from the city. So, I mean, this seems to be an epidemic that's just growing in every city, mostly blue cities, kind of like Washington, D.C., and there's no end to it. But really, I believe the community should have an input. They should have a meeting or a town hall set up where community input matters, because that's your constituents.
No. What they need to do, they need to change these laws from Baltimore to D.C. across these cities, where they allow these juveniles to wreak havoc on these communities without any consequences. This is what they need to do. Leonard, I was listening to Greco, and you have members of Congress. You just saw where former Senator McNally was accosted when she was out running in Arizona. You have members of congressional staff members that have been hijacked with the gun pointed to their head. Just this weekend, I decided to go out to, which Greco mentioned, I decided to go out to the White House to cover to see how the grounds were since the protest. And there was this woman sitting on Lafayette statue in broad daylight with her pipe smoking crack, which is illegal. I turned to the park police. They said, no. This cannot happen here. You have got to put a stop to this. And lo and behold, the U.S. Park Police removed her but did not arrest her. You know what he had to say? What he said? If he had arrested her, she would have been back out on the street 24 hours later. Their hands are tied. They have no ability to keep these people locked up, and it's no different than these youth. So based on your expertise and what we're talking about here today, what needs to change?
90%, Armstrong, of the conversation over the last 3 or 4 decades about crime and justice has been leniency towards offenders, has been stop the heavy hand of fate, stop incarcerating so many people, stop arresting so many people. So now what we have are record decreases in arrests. We have record decreases in incarceration. Hell, there are groups out there who are telling us that parole and probation is too harsh. That fines, people can't pay those fines. We should not be fining people. For the love of heavens, when are we going to start waking up and understanding that unless we hold offenders accountable for their crimes, we're never going to be able to come to grips with the utter and complete record fear of crime throughout the country. But in terms of D.C., the district itself, I mean, most people enter and live in the District of Columbia in fear.
Greco, look, is it too late? I mean, from New York to Baltimore to Washington, D.C., to Atlanta, to Los Angeles, and they decided to clean up San Francisco just because the heads of states are there and the president is going soon. So they can clean up the city because Xi Jinping is there. But after he leaves, then it goes back to the normal with all the camps, all the drugs, all the opioid, all the crime. But for a few days, we're going to make it seem like it's perfect. What is going on with these elected officials? They have no kind of loyalty to the voters to make their streets safe, to make their communities safe, to clean up these drugs, to clean up the homelessness, to stop this juvenile violence. The criminals are running the asylum.
You know, Armstrong, you just mentioned one thing, and the key here is the word accountability. There's no accountability, whether it be for elected officials or in the police department. I mean, in the police departments themselves, they don't hold each other accountable. You have rogue. I mean, I could just take my former organization, NYPD. There is all kinds of corruption going on in New York City, from the mayor himself, Eric Adams, to the police commissioner, I mean, it's just chaos going on up and down the ranks. And when no one's being held accountable, and then they have these arbitrary rules where they terminate somebody like me because they didn't like that I was a friend of someone that they didn't like, but they themselves are hanging out with criminals and felons and all night long in nightclubs. I mean, this is the upper echelon, the NYPD. That will now translate to the street, because if you're okaying this kind of behavior, how can you be the ones to judge other people, the regular civilians in the street or the criminals, because you're hobnobbing with them? So there's all kinds of no accountability being laid out here. The elected officials, what are they doing? They basically come out there. They come out there to pander for votes for about, whatever it is, election time, and then they disappear again. I mean, if they come to a rally, if you have a rally like these rallies that happen in New York, where they're rallying against the illegal migrants and illegal undocumented people that are moving into these locations in the shelters. I mean, when a politician shows up, everybody just wants to leave and go home. I mean, they had one rally where there's like 5 people there. Meanwhile, where you have the grassroots community, the people having their rallies, there's thousands of people there. So it's, again, there's no accountability. I still believe in the system where you still can elect people, but it's very hard in these blue cities where it's 7-1 Democrat to Republican. And these moderate Democrats who may or may not break an election either way, they're either staying home or they're still voting the same way.
Yeah, but Sal, what about law enforcement? I mean, you guys turn your head on certain crimes. You operate in groups. You feel your hands are tied, and so it gives you a reason. Why am I going to bother? They're going to put them back on the street. They're crimes that you can stop, but you just turn another way. What about law enforcement commitment to do the right thing, protect the communities, and not because of, but in spite of the leadership?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, as a lot of times when I was working, I thought exactly the same thing that you're saying, but your problem is going to be you're going to have a little pushback in that these district attorneys seem to be weaponized against law enforcement, meaning if you don't go along with their projections and their way of doing business in the street, they're going to go against you. You also in New York City, I don't know if it's like that down there in D.C., but we have what's called a civilian complaint review board. So any civilian can make any complaint, whether it's true or false. Then you're going down to this little meeting where you meet with a lawyer from the civil rights group, we'll say, and ACLU, and they have all these people there. You have your accuser and whether you're found exonerated, guilty, they still try to take vacation days from you. They still want to penalize you. So as long as you have this kind of stuff in your face, like in New York City, for a cop, it's very demoralizing. It's very hard for a cop to say, I'm going to be proactive and I want to save the streets. But what are the repercussions? Am I going to lose my job, my pension? Are they going to try to jail me? Am I going to get a criminal case? I mean, this is all the things that happen, and it's the system. They weaponize the system against you. It's very hard to break this, especially with these weaponized district attorneys.
Sal, Greco, Leonard Snipes will return on Your Voice, Your Future. I'm Armstrong Williams. If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. You know, Leonard, I'm curious, what role do you think media plays in shaping policy responses to crime and law enforcement practices? You know, Sal makes an excellent point about how they make it so difficult for law enforcement to do their job. Anybody can make allegations against them to cripple them. The system does not want them to tackle certain crimes. What if the fourth estate were to do their jobs? How would this change?
I'm sorry, Armstrong, the question is again, it's the state?
The fourth estate is the media. What if the media held these politicians in these streets accountable for this crime and these opioids? What if they decided to do their job?
The U.S. Department of Justice just declared a crisis in staffing of law enforcement. We have tens of thousands of police officers that have left. We have a lot of police officers who have been completely demoralized. Quite frankly, the media, unfortunately, is a big part of that problem. During the use of force demonstrations that happened all throughout the country beginning in 2014, the media made law enforcement out to be the enemy. And a lot of people, tens of thousands within law enforcement, basically said, okay, if you're going to make me out to be the enemy based upon the illegal crap, admittedly, that a handful of people were engaged in, and if you're going to stereotype a million human beings, we're out. We're done. We had family members all throughout the country insist that their loved ones get out of law enforcement and get out of law enforcement now. So the media was a big part of that ridiculous stereotyping of cops. You know, if I would basically encounter or use the same stereotypes towards African Americans or towards women or towards Latinos, my career would be over. But, media felt perfectly comfortable in terms of doing that to 1 million people within law enforcement. And so, you have this problem throughout the United States of people basically saying, that's it, I'm done. If you're going to respond that way to me through the media, if the media is going to portray me as being this brutal, hard person who just does not care about the larger society and he just does not care about enforcing the law properly, I'm leaving. I'm getting out.
Sal Greco, and I can tell you felt betrayed in terms of, and I'm sure we'll never know all the details of why you were let go. You're someone that wanted to serve. But from your extensive experience as a member of the NYPD
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4
and law enforcement, what are the most significant challenges you face in dealing with crime, and how do they compare with public perceptions? And what do you know that absolutely work that these legislators, these city councils, and these mayors refuse to enforce?
Well, Armstrong, they seem to. I mean, I was a big person. I enforced drunk drivers, DWIs. That was my pet peeve, because I figured out in New York City Police Department, when you go for a crime that you want to stop, like a robbery or a burglary or the bigger crimes, those rely on witnesses, and you need them to come to court. And anything could happen. It's kind of like a crapshoot. You think you have a solid case, the witness will get on the stand. Next thing you know, the defense attorney's ripping the witness to shreds. I always like these, drunk driving arrests because it's one-on-one. It's my observation versus you. Everything was now on body camera. So when I went to court, I mean, I had an impeccable record. I never lost a case for those reasons. I was very meticulous with my work. And I believe city council in New York City, they still like the fact that cops would enforce drunk driving or DWIs. But you're seeing it now not even barely being enforced out there. And that's because of the way that cops feel. Because cops feel that nobody has their back. As you could tell when you were stating before, when you arrest somebody, they're out in 5 minutes. I mean, there's been cases where I know cops that were arresting somebody for some offense, and then as they're finishing their paperwork, they take them down to central booking or whatever the case is that they sent them down there for. And they're coming back before he's done with the paperwork. He was supposed to voucher this person's property, and they're already coming back to pick it up within an hour. So that's where we're at. And you can't, I mean, the laws in New York, where Cuomo changed them, were all these ridiculous laws, and you only have a certain amount of days for discovery. And this kind of stuff was weaponized in order to favor the criminal. And I don't mean like, I know that we're trying to fix the criminal justice system, and some things are a little egregious, but you understand that those big criminals and the big crimes those people are now taking advantage of the system because there was never any checks and balances to it. So I agree that you have to change it, yes, but to a certain degree, because now it's complete chaos, because if you give a criminal an inch, they're going to take a mile. And that's what you're seeing in all these jurisdictions, because they're all passing the same rules and laws that, well, it's going to go easy on the criminal, but you can't go easy on certain criminals. And the judges should have their input. And they took that away from New York City and those judges. So that's why you're seeing guys like literally out in 1 hour. And that's ridiculous, Armstrong. I think a lot of people would agree with that.
I saw the footage where they call him the Good Samaritan, fired the gun in the air to stop someone who was being assaulted. But my goodness, you cannot bear arms in New York. I mean, yep. you just can't. And while I am thrilled that he was there to prevent further harm to this person, I mean, I don't see this guy as some hero. I mean, he had a firearm. And if he had a firearm there, where else could he have had a firearm? And then also, you said something, though, that the pendulum has swung all the way to the left, where it's just overcompensating the criminals for the egregious acts of maybe a few bad apples, law enforcement. But obviously, law enforcement, as well as legislature and elected officials, can see the handwriting on the wall that their cities are being destroyed. It would seem to me that they would be the first line responders to change this. Why? Is it money? Is it lucrative? What is driving this?
I think what's driving it, Armstrong, is the fact that
not Leonard. No, not Leonard's audio. I can't deal with the audio. You, Sal, please answer that.
I believe that it's definitely driven by money. There's a lot of money in politics. There's dark money. And I think that's what's driving this agenda, because it seems like you says that legislatively, nobody does anything unless it affects them. And we could have one clear example where Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked by some maniac, and look at the way that was being handled. You have an incident with, I believe, Michelle Obama and Barack Obama, where somebody
drowned in the swimming pool. Drowned, yes, absolutely.
That's another incident that all of a sudden you saw this. See how different. So it's arbitrary.
And either he was there, he wasn't there, or he was there. Look.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. That's a very good point. Let me try Leonard. I don't think Leonard's audio is there, but Leonard, go ahead, respond.
Not quite sure how to respond. The point is that we have lost our cities. The citizens are afraid. Their investment is not going into cities. Cities are being destroyed, and we're letting it happen. And why we're not pushing back, it's completely beyond my comprehension. The overwhelming majority, where this is really hitting the hardest, is the poor communities and cities, or the poor African-American communities within cities. These kids are growing up, so they're their entire lives afraid. They're afraid to walk the streets. They're afraid to leave their homes. It's just so sad. It's so incredibly sad, but nobody else sees it that way except the people who live in those communities. And because, the people who talk about crime more often than not, they don't live in these communities. They live far away from these communities, and yet they want sympathy for criminals. Either you're on the side of the criminals or you're on the side of the average person. And I'm on the side of the average person, and I want to see the average person safe. I do not want to see people live in fear. So until we start holding criminals accountable, until we start holding politicians accountable, this is going to continue. I've been to numerous community meetings in Washington, D.C., where the individual people were standing up and saying, do something to keep us safe. but nobody ever seems to listen to them. And I have no idea as to why that occurs without the citizens of any city, especially Washington, D.C., rising up in rebellion against the justice system as it currently exists and the politicians as they currently exist. Why that's not happening is beyond my comprehension.
Sal, in 30 seconds, if law enforcement in the cities, if they supported them, wanted to change this overnight, could they?
You see a drastic change. You let the NYPD do their job, you'd see a big change in New York City. I'm not talking about the Fugazi numbers that Eric Adams throws out there because they're all fake. I mean, crime is up. In the last 2 years, crime has been up through the roof, and he's just saying, oh, crime is down 0.1%. Give me a break.
Listen,
let the cops do their job, Eric.
You heard it from Sal Greco. You heard it from Leonard Snipes. If they wanted to change this trajectory of crime, this car theft, the hijackings, the homicide, and the youth out of control, they could change it in a snap. What does it tell you? You must be the change. You must demand it. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Your Voice, Your Future. We want to thank all our guests. I'm Armstrong Williams.